so great to be here tonight, seeing some old friends and some new faces. And I am really excited to be talking to Frank about baking. And special thanks to you, Frank, for being here since you're in Vermont 3 hours ahead of us. So before we begin to talk about baking, let's talk about you and King Arthur Baking Company. So you've been doing R&D there for almost 20 years. What exactly do you do?
Well, Sky, R&D is sort of a crazy kind of place at King Arthur. I basically wear two hats. Part of the time, I am pure science, no emotion. The test has to be fair. Then on the other side is the development side, where I sort of just let my inner 7-year-old out, and I get to play with flavor and texture and new ingredients and new packaging and different ways of putting things together. So it's really it's a very two-sided coin.
So speaking of product development, what product have you worked on that you're most proud of?
I think the one that I'm most proud of is our gluten-free measure for measure flour. We had to come up with a flour for our gluten-free customers that made it really easy for them to make wonderful, yummy things. And it was a big lift. And it took us about a year to do all the research, to do all the development, to get it through the approval process and get it to market. And it's been very well received. It's been on the market for about 5 or 6 years now. And it's great because it works just like all-purpose flour.
So you had mentioned to me that the gluten-free flour had a personal connection for you. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I'm the uncle in the family, and I have a nephew who's a celiac. And, it was really tough when he was first diagnosed. And then I started working in R&D, and, we wanted to have something that was a lot of fun. So having that connection with him visiting for holidays and being able to bake with him and do things with something that was easy for him to do, because it just sort of drove me to get it as perfect as possible. Yeah.
That is such a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. And so this is the first year that King Arthur has visibly supported Pride by organizing blog posts related to baking and Pride,
Mhm.
as well as donating to the Trevor Project and encouraging your customers to do so as well. So how did that come about?
We, as you know, we've rebranded. We've gone from King Arthur Flour to King Arthur Baking because we've always been about baking. And we really believe that the more bakers in the kitchen, the better. And we wanted to make a step in that direction by being, a little more open about what we believe in. And we thought we would start with Pride this year. It was a really positive experience. Our customers pretty much loved it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm really happy to see more and more companies coming out and supporting LGBTQ communities. So it's great to see King Arthur doing it as well.
Yeah.
So let's talk about baking.
Okay.
So let's start off with something really basic. Using the correct amount of flour in a recipe is very important for baking success.
Yes.
So can you explain how we should all be doing that?
So if a recipe gives you a weight, use the weight. It doesn't matter if it says it's 1 1/4 cups or 1 1/3 cups. It doesn't matter. Use the weight. Or if you're old fashioned like me and still do everything by measuring cups, the way you measure flour at King Arthur is you get your flour container out, you fluff the flour up, you sprinkle it into a measuring cup, and you sweep it off. Start with our method. You can always add a little more flour if you think it looks thin. Getting an ounce of flour out, I haven't figured out how to do that yet.
That is great advice. Thank you. And And now that we got that basic thing out of the way, let's talk about my favorite thing, which is cookies.
Hmm.
So I'm going to ask you about some ingredients and how they affect a cookie.
Okay.
So let's start off with sugar. Granulated white sugar versus powdered sugar versus brown sugar.
So granulated sugar is what's in almost everything. Um, Granulated white sugar, it helps with structure, it melts quick, it makes things crunchy, makes things tender. Powdered sugar is just white sugar that's been pulverized and then has about 10% cornstarch added to it. That's going to make things cakier. It's going to make things a little more tender from the added starch. A great example of that type of cookie would be like Mexican wedding cookies. You make them with powdered sugar and they almost explode in your mouth. They're so tender. Brown sugar is just white sugar that hasn't gotten fully refined. So it has what's called refiner's syrup. And the refiner's syrup is what gives it that color and that flavor, that molassesy, that darker brown sugar flavor. Brown sugar is going to make things a little softer. It's going to make them a little chewier. And it's going to, again, contribute sweetness and that molasses flavor.
Okay, well, how about baking powder versus baking soda?
Baking powder is what we call a complete leavener. It is acid and base balanced in one product. So all you have to do is measure it out and it's going to work. Baking soda is only half of that. Baking soda is just the base. It needs acid to react with. One is pretty much just use it and don't worry. The other one is you've got to make sure you've got all the things you need for it to work.
Okay, so now once I've made my cookie dough and I need to put them on the cookie sheet, how important is it to use a cookie scoop?
A scoop is going to make sure everything is the same size and pretty much the same weight. That way, they all bake at the same time. It's going to make your baking very consistent.
Gotcha. And then once the cookies are done, how important is to cool them on a wire rack? Could I use parchment paper or paper towels instead?
A wire rack is just the most efficient, which is why they always list that in the recipes. It's like, use a wire rack. Well, if you're a minimalist kind of cook, you might not have all this equipment. So using parchment, just sliding the parchment paper onto the counter, it's going to cool the cookies off. Lifting the cookies off the hot pan and just laying them across paper towel, it's going to take them away from that constant heat as well. Because a cookie pan is going to stay hot for about 2 minutes and the cookies are going to keep baking. So if it tells you to take the cookies off, whatever you can do to get them off and get them onto something else that isn't hot, it's a good thing.
Okay, that sounds great. And I wanted to ask you about one of your favorite cookie recipes, gluten-free thumbprint cookies.
It's a recipe that I like particularly because I got to make it with Joel when he was younger. And it's one, it's yummy. Two, it's colorful. Three, you can make one dough, but depending on the different kinds of jams you use, you can get 8 different flavors out of the same thing.
They do look really wonderful, and I actually can't wait to give it a try sometime.
Yeah.
Now, I saw a recipe, the no bake peanut butter chocolate squares recipe on the King Arthur website, and I actually tried it today. And they
Excellent.
amazingly, yeah, they taste like peanut butter cups. And I could not believe um, that you could do this without baking it. And it's funny to see it on King Arthur's website, considering I don't think it uses any King Arthur products in it.
Well, not everything on our website is to necessarily promote our flour. The recipe section is to promote baking. Yes, we make flour. Yes, we provide all the special ingredients, but we're a baking company. And if you're baking, we're happy.
Okay, so now let's move on to cakes.
Okay.
So most of us have all-purpose flour in our pantry, but I think most people do not have cake flour. Now, what is cake flour, and how can you make a cake if you don't have any cake flour?
Cake flour is, you're right, it's a specialty ingredient. Cake flour is made from soft wheat. It's chlorinated, so it's bleached with chlorine specifically. And the chlorine changes the way the starch is able to hold liquids. So you can put in lots of butter, you can put in lots of milk, you can put in lots of eggs, and the flour is able to hold all of that and still be very tender. If you don't have cake flour and you want to make a recipe that's written for cake flour, all you need to do is take your measuring cup, put in 2 tablespoons of cornstarch, then fluff up your all purpose flour, sprinkle it over the top, level it off, then sift all of that together, and you'll be able to mimic cake flour.
Now, cakes that we buy from the bakery are so perfect and flat. Now,
Mhm.
how can we get a flat top baking cakes at home?
The easiest way is to just take a long slicing knife and level off the cake.
Oh, but
That's
that
the
is such
fast
a
way.
waste.
Well, that you use that for cake pops, for little.
Okay.
But to bake a cake so that you don't have to trim it and you don't have that waste, you want to make sure you're using a pan that's appropriate. And the most important thing to keep in mind for a level cake is to have a pan that's at least 2 inches deep. Because what makes that cake dome is if the pan is too short, the sidewalls are too short, the top sets before the heat has gotten through the cake. So you've got basically a hard surface, and then you're going to keep putting more heat in, and that baking powder is going to keep expanding, and it's only got one way to go, and it's going to make this huge dome. So that's why you want a pan that has a 2 inch sidewall. It's those tall sidewalls are going to protect the top of the cake from the heat. The other thing is never fill your cake pan more than 2/3 full.
Now, one of the most popular cake recipes on the website is the King Arthur Original Cake Pancake.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
The cake pancake shows up in our archives probably at the end of the Depression during the Second World War, so late 30s, mid 40s, and it was developed for rationing. There's no eggs, there's no milk, there's no butter. It's made with flour, baking soda, vinegar. It's made with water, cocoa powder. So you could have a rich, flavorful, moist chocolate cake without all of the things that you didn't have access to anymore. And 80 years later, the cake pancake is just back at the top of the list. It never goes off the list because now fits a lot of today's, healthier lifestyle. So much so that Charlotte, who does recipe development at King Arthur, she came up with a vanilla and a spice version of it as well. So if you want a egg-free, butter-free, dairy-free cake that's vanilla, we've got it. Spice cake, we've got it. Gluten-free, we've got it. It's really sort of funny that something that was designed due to restriction remains popular 80 years later, but for completely different reasons.
So
Yeah.
it looks amazing. And and I would like to share a recipe as well with everyone out there. So I have a Japanese souffle cheesecake that's
Oh,
on the website, and it's really amazing. It's just this light and fluffy cheesecake.
yeah.
Um, and I did a special edition for the USC Asian Pacific Alumni Association homecoming which is decorated with the USC Athletics logo. So everyone can check that out on my website. So now let's talk about bread.
Okay.
Some bread recipes use all purpose flour,
Mhm.
and some bread recipes use bread flour. How do those two different flours affect the bread?
All-purpose flour is just that. It's general purpose. It's the workhorse. It does lots of things really well. You can make, use it for some rye rolls, you can use it for muffins, all those sorts of things. But if you want to get a really high rising, crusty, bouncy loaf of bread, bread flour is going to go there because bread flour, like its name, it's designed for bread.
So, how about recipes that use water versus ones that also have eggs or butter or use milk?
Recipes that just use water are usually very traditional artisan recipes. We call those lean doughs because they're very lean. They don't have all of those yummier things that you just mentioned. So flour, water, salt, and yeast. Baguettes, 4 ingredients. They're tender, they're crunchy, they've got big holes in them, they stale very quickly. You bake a baguette at 4 in the morning, you better serve it by lunchtime because by dinner time at 8 o'clock, it's going to be stale. They have a very short shelf life. Those other ingredients, when you start putting those into bread, you start enriching it. So they become more delicate, they become moister, they become a little more compressive when you chew them. So if you, the best example of when you put all of those things into bread, it's called brioche. Now you'd never confuse brioche with a baguette, but they're both made with all-purpose flour. It's just one has eggs and butter and milk in it, and one of them doesn't.
So, I see recipes with active dry yeast, some with instant yeast, and others with rapid rise yeast. What are the differences?
So in 2020, there is practically no difference between active dry yeast and instant yeast. Active dry yeast was different 20 years ago. So you had to, put it with some water, some sugar, let it get foamy before you added it. Those days are pretty much gone. Now, rapid rise yeast is a completely different beast. Rapid rise yeast is a proprietary strain of yeast developed by Fleischmann's, and it's designed for only one strong rise. So you make the dough, you put the dough in the pan, you let it rise, and you bake it.
All the rage right now is sourdough bread,
Mhm.
but that requires a starter. Could you explain what a starter is?
Basically, a starter is what we used to use before we had active dry yeast. A starter is a collection of wild yeast that is maintained in a flour and water mixture. And to use it, you give it some energy, it comes to life, you bake bread with it, you maintain the health of it, and you just carry it forward, carry it forward, carry it forward.
If I were making bread for the first time, what recipe would you recommend that I start with?
I have two. One would be just any no knead bread recipe where you just get a bucket, you throw in some water, you throw in some flour, you throw in some yeast, you throw in some salt, you stir it together. The flour organizes itself, and a few hours later, you can scoop something out, make a ball, let it rise, and bake it, and you've got bread. And it's going to look like an artisan loaf, and people will be amazed that you've been able to do this. If you want to try something that might be a little faster um, and is just as easy, we've got a thing that we call blitz bread. And it's just fast focaccia. You take flour, water, salt, yeast, and you add a little olive oil to it. You stir it together in a stand mixer. You drop it in a pan. You coat it with oil. You poke it with your fingers. You throw it in a hot oven, and you've got fast focaccia. And it's got good flavor, and it's oily, and it's crunchy.
Well, that blitz bread sounds amazing, so I'm definitely going to give that a try.
Yeah.
So, Frank, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. I know I've learned a few things, and I bet you everyone out there has learned something as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure.